When two experts disagree, two trusted experts disagree, it suggests
Right.
there's more nuance that there is yet to be discovered. And
Yes.
both of them should agree on that.
I'm with Kevin Folta, a professor of the horticultural science department at the University of Florida. He's done research in functional genomics of small fruit crops, photomorphogenesis, and controlled environments, and genetic basis of flavors. He's also a science communicator and does a lot of outreach for basically sciences and more biotechnology. He has a podcast called Talking Biotech and another podcast which is Science Facts and Fallacies. Both you said weekly. You
Both
put
weekly. Yeah.
a lot of work, yeah. So yeah, maybe what we can start with the podcast, but more like general. Like, what are you interested in when you're communicating sciences? Like in a big topics, what have you focused mostly when you're spreading the word of whatever you like?
Well, there's two ways to solve this problem. And the first is you can get people excited about science by telling them what it is and how things work. That's how most people learn science. And it's also why people also get turned off about science.
Mm-hmm.
But if I tell you about a problem you have, a problem in the environment, a problem in our health, a problem in crops, and then I tell you a cool solution to solve it, now you get excited. So I try to do these things from a much more rhetorical standpoint. Here's a problem that we care about. How do we fix it? And then we use biotechnology and other science to get to there.
Okay. So, do you have an example for that, or how you do it, of the topics that you've mostly talked about over your career?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, there's so many. Probably the best example is the Hawaiian papaya.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an example of Hawaii being an exporter of papayas. It's a traditional crop, has deep meaning for many people there. And a virus was moving across the islands. And it came to the big island and was devastating the area where they grew papayas. And a native son, Dr. Dennis Gonsalves from Hawaii, born on the one island out on the end there. It escapes me what it's called. But
Yeah, I
Kauai.
don't know
I've
even
been
the
there. I've
names
been
of
there.
the islands.
He was born on Kauai. He was a scientist. He was working between USDA, Cornell, and they collaborated to develop a genetically engineered papaya that would resist the virus, and it's still grown today, 20
Nice.
some years later, and still works, and in fantastic technology.
So, what was the virus doing to the papaya? Just kind of killing it, making it worse.
It makes unappealing fruit that has a lot of scars and little, damage to the fruit, but then it also causes a steady decline in the plant itself. So you lose eventually over the course of years, you lose yield and then eventually lose the crop altogether.
Yeah. So this is a perfect example. I think if you're okay with that, we can start with genetically modified organisms, right?
Sure.
Because that has been very controversial, but I think we'll talk about your opinions on it. But maybe we can talk about what exactly those are. I know that they've been kind of that's like a big label, right? It is that genetically modified organisms can mean very different things.
Yeah.
So what are they?
Well, it's kind of a meaningless term in a lot of
Exactly.
ways, right? Because you are a significant modification of your parents.
Right, that's true.
Right, you're a
Yeah,
combination
genetic
of,
modification.
you only
yeah.
match half of each one.
Yeah, I like it.
And so we all are walking around as modifications of our ancestors. And so when we talk about modification, it's kind of a sloppy term. Breeding is when we
Yes.
mash 50,000 genes and 50,000 genes and put them together in ways that nature never could and that we never predicted could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do genetic engineering, and that's the difference. You're
Yes.
an engineer,
Right.
so you're an aerospace engineer.
And mechanical, but yes.
A mechanical engineer.
Yes.
A mechanical engineer. So what's a really cool thing that we engineer mechanically?
Like the space shuttle or something.
A space
like
shuttle. Okay, so would you rather fly in an engineered space shuttle or a modified space shuttle?
Mm-hmm.
You see, engineering shows the precision and the technology. And so when we're talking about a genetically engineered organism, we're either talking about bacteria that are made to make insulin for humans to treat diabetes, for curing sickle cell disease, by correcting a gene with genetic engineering, solving the COVID pandemic with genetically engineered little piece of a virus mimic, Or in the case of agriculture, allowing plants to survive a pest or pathogen because they're engineered to resist it. One gene added rather than mixing in tons of genes.
That is pretty interesting because from the sound that you were explaining, it sounds that even in genetic engineering, there's many branches of like what, uh, or I guess it can be the same thing because what I was thinking mostly is like you have, let's say, the strawberry and you change some genes within the strawberry, or you add some genes from, I guess that is one thing. When you add genes from another uh, species that it's not strawberry, it might be considered a different thing. Tell me if I'm saying something that is not correct. And I guess those two, and because I was contrasting it with the viruses, that viruses somehow in my mind was something like different, right? Because we were doing something to the virus and then putting it on us that would then do the consequence that we would like to happen, right? Like the vaccines.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Well, you're bringing up a lot of things there. So the vaccine is cool because all the vaccine is it's one little signature of the virus, one little piece that we give the instructions to our cells to say, make this little piece of virus. It's not the whole virus. It can't hurt you, but it can train our immune system to recognize it. And it's the same thing our immune system does all day, every day. We're exposed to pathogens constantly, and our immune system is constantly mounting a defense. The difference is that here's a way for us to say, here's something you might want to look out for, rather than having to catch the virus and develop the immune response to an infection. Because the infection can be hazardous, can be have severe consequences. In the case of genetic engineering in something like plants, you mentioned the idea of maybe moving a gene from strawberry to strawberry, which there's no genetically engineered strawberries, unfortunately. We have a gene which works really well in plants to give resistance to different diseases. And we turned it on at a high level in strawberry, and it made the strawberries very resistant to disease to the point where we didn't need to use fungicides. Huge environmental benefit to the consumer and to the farmer. It doesn't have to spray fungicides.
Yeah. Fungicides.
Everybody wins, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's a product that we could never sell or never develop because of fear of the technology. So the environment, the farmer, and the consumer lose. You can continue to spray fungicides, and there's no control for the disease outside of that. So it's a way to create genetic controls that allow us to not have to depend on chemistry or management.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Maybe we can explore a little bit of the genetically modified organisms, because I heard you say, I think in one interview, for example, and I mentioned this just for people to understand that genetically modified organism can mean many different things, as you were saying, right? For example, like the corns, right? Like, can you tell me the history of corn? How has it changed over many years, and why people can definitely say that it's a genetically modified organism, right?
It's a beautiful example. If you look at modern corn and you look at its great, 1,000 generations back grandparent, it was a little stick about that big. I'm holding my fingers 4 centimeters apart, with 13 little kernels on there that were hard as a rock, and it would be very challenging to eat, but people somewhere found some nutritional value, and some people believe that they would put it in fire and pop it like popcorn.
Oh, interesting.
And that was how it was consumed.
And we know about this stuff because of like basically archaeologists. I'm not sure if archaeologists is right, where like people that study, like they pick up something and it's like, oh, carbon dated, and see, oh, this is definitely like not from last week, right?
Right. No, you're exactly right. It's archaeologists and forensic anthropologists that find evidence of ancient crops, mostly seeds and maybe other types of evidence, imprints, things like that, but also the writing and artwork of different cultures that they can say associate with this. And we know that the history of corn goes back quite a ways, but probably about 20,000 years from Mexico, in which this thing called teosinte, it's like a big bush, like a weed, that would grow these little seed heads.
Yeah, you were mentioning.
And they would grow that somebody said, well, I always have to go there to get my teosinte. Why don't I bring it back home? And bring a plant home, or maybe realize that they dropped some seeds along the way, and now I've had teosinte plants growing everywhere they dropped the seeds. And eventually, you started to develop farmers and agricultural disciplines and plant breeders who would make better crops, and it would happen by accident. They would throw some in the garbage or by the latrines, and you would have plants grow there. And wait a minute, teosinte is growing here. How did that happen? Well, that's where I put the garbage. Well, maybe there's something in there that means we could get the next plant from it. And then agriculture was born. And the next year they planted 100 of them. And then a few years later, they had hundreds and hundreds of these plants. They'd grow them for the village. And maybe other people, since they didn't have to hunt and gather, they could take on other jobs, like maybe making clothing or raising children or animals or something. So agriculture and the birth of corn allowed the division of labor that allowed civilizations to explode, allowed populations to increase, that people didn't have to hunt and gather so you could have a family. Because your family didn't have to be nomadic and follow with you, right? You didn't have to carry one, So all these things are based upon early agriculture. And corn over those years turned a lot. Genes changed when you had those 100 plants in the village and you had a bad insect infestation. Maybe all of them died except one plant. The next year you took those seeds and planted from that. And when the insects came, they all lived. Because we were selecting.
Because it was that one plant that survived that was, you could say, tougher than the others in that sense to survive that. You said virus or something.
Or insects,
right?
Yeah.
And that, if you then keep breeding it and keep making more copies, or copies of them,
offspring.
Exactly, offspring of them. They'll be majority with them would be equally as tough to those insects, right?
Well, possibly, yeah. So that goes back to this idea of genetic modification.
Right.
That plant, that survivor, had some genes on board that nobody else had that allowed it to survive. And by default, that one made it to the next generation. And so that first farmer who selected that plant was the first plant breeder. And they said, we're going to now make something that's even more improved. And over time, this continual change over time, maybe there was one that had, instead of having 13, had 26. Or maybe there was the thing on the outside called the gloom, this hard protective case, that went away. That you had plants that had more tillers, had more branches that, or fewer, that maybe just grow on one single stalk. That now is a beneficial trait for the farmer. And over the course of 10,000 years, we got to modern corn that in 1920 would give you 15 bushels per acre. Today's modern corn, because of hybrids, because of breeding and selection, and then in the 1990s, genetic engineering, now you can get 258 bushels per acre. And sometimes if you really push it, you can get 400.
Okay.
So this is the amazing change that occurred.
Yeah. It really is fascinating, like how evolution works. And it's also interesting how it doesn't have to be natural, right? Like, it can be artificial selection of genes. Like, for example, I love, you've talked about this, like, oh, I have this fruit or this corn, and maybe this one looks a little bit better, or I taste it and it tastes a little bit better. So maybe let's just do more of those. Like, I like more of those yellow, brighter ones. So then you do those and you artificially select those, right? That is pretty fascinating. And like how for thousands of years we've done that artificial gene selection. So let's contrast that with the engineering, right? So what is the process there, or what really happens, and how is that different than what we've been saying about like selecting offspring that then propagate themselves? And
yeah, well, all the work with breeding and selection always was educated guesses.
right,
It was taking a guess that if we bring this parent that has some good genetics and this one together, maybe
Right.
we'll get that in the next generation.
exactly, yeah,
And the problem is that when you're moving 30,000 genes and mixing them with 30,000 genes, and then you're
Okay.
looking in the offspring, you're going to get some of the ones you want, but you'll get some things you don't want.
right. It's like maybe we
So-
have two parents that are very tall, and he's just like, oh, these are gonna have a very tall kid, and they just happen to have like everything similar, like eyes, color, whatever, except the height.
Except the tall, right?
Exactly.
So now you have to do crossing back against the parents, which we can do in plants, but
In
not in
plants.
animals so much. Not advisable. But you can do these things and try to concentrate a specific gene. But you can imagine, what if you're working on chestnut trees and you get flowering every 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
The next generation, 10 years to flower.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take you a long time to beat the diseases and the problems and the challenges imposed by modern life. We move around diseases, we move around insects. So in order to have agility to meet these new challenges fast, we need something like genetic engineering.
And what is it? Like, what are? Because I've been curious, like, how does that functions? Like, is it always normally like you have some sort of like list of genes and then you can select them like almost with really high precision that is like a sheet, and then let's cut this, get this out, put this in, almost like that.
Well, it's more like a word processor. Over the last,
Okay.
I guess, over the last 20 years, since we knew all the genes in a plant, which was first plant was a Arabidopsis sequenced in 2001, where we learned all the genes from beginning to end in general.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what most of them did,
Mm-hmm.
but we knew the sequences.
Mm.
And over the last 20 years, we've learned different genes have different roles. And if you can know the gene sequence, you can then amplify that gene, like we do for a crime scene, where you find a cigarette butt or a soda can or a postage stamp or a human hair, and you can say, okay, we got a few cells, we can amplify that DNA and see who it belongs to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since we know what the gene is, we can amplify that little piece of DNA and make a bucket of it. And then we can take that gene and we can put that into a mechanism called a plasmid, which is a circular piece of DNA that we introduce this other piece into by splicing it in.
Mm-hmm.
And it has all the control regions for the plant, the things that turn it on and turn it off. We call them promoters, the regions of the gene that control what will happen with that gene being turned on. So it's a little piece of the blueprint that we now have. We can put into a plasmid and now introduce that plasmid into the plant.
Mm-hmm.
And we can do it in a couple ways. One way is to use a naturally occurring bacterium that transfers DNA. We give it to the bacterium and say, go do your stuff. It puts it in the plant cell. And then we take that one plant cell, grow it into a clump of cells. And then just like when you make a cutting and you can have the bottom of the plant grow roots
Mm-hmm.
where there were none,
Mm-hmm.
you can take that one little clump of cells and have it grow in the leaves and stems and roots just by changing the media that it's on. And so if it starts with one cell and then we grow it into a whole plant, that whole plant will have the same DNA that was in that foundational cell and carrying our new trait.
That is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's fun to do.
So why would we be doing this? You mentioned already that we cannot do this modification of genes in a shorter time scale because just of the randomness that it produces. So we can have this technology that allows us to have a little bit more precision in what we're doing. But why would we want to do this? Or like, what are the benefits of having a genetically engineered organism?
There's two sets of benefits. The first is that we can move a trait that we're really interested in much faster. It allows us the speed of being able to precisely move one gene in a short time.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. But the other powerful side of this is that we can move genes that weren't necessarily supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So just like when humans, people are diabetic, we have 45 million diabetics in the United States. You could take the gene for human insulin and put it in bacteria and now have bacteria that can produce human insulin. It's a huge benefit.
Mm-hmm.
In plants, we could take the disease resistance, or let's say the gene from bacteria that makes a compound that is toxic to insect larvae.
Mm-hmm.
And you can put that in the corn. And now corn and cotton, or cotton, will make this protein in every cell that is toxic to insect larvae. So when the insect larvae comes along and starts to feed on the corn, it dies. So you don't need to apply insecticide.
Mm-hmm.
And that protein that kills the larvae has no effect on you. So it's so wonderful that here you can have a corn plant protect itself or a cotton plant protect itself and not have to worry about insecticides. It's brilliant.
What? Yeah, it really is. What other types goes? Can you explain a little bit more of the, for example, the nutritional side of it? When we have those plants that we ingest, like the rice and all these very popular examples.
Well, the rice example you might be referring to is goldenrod.
Yes.
So, yeah, we've known for a long time that there is a problem on the planet with vitamin A deficiency, and they estimate 1 million children a year die from vitamin A deficiency. I'm guessing it's much higher because the students, professor, the children that are affected by vitamin A deficiency are not in places where people are counting. And it's mostly because world food staples like rice, wheat, corn, potato, they are a carbohydrate source that doesn't have a lot of vitamin A. That comes from something called beta carotene, which is the orange stuff in carrots and leafy green veggies. And someone once thought, and this was Ingo Potricus and Peter Baer.
Okay.
Yeah, they said, well, why don't we take the genes for beta carotene synthesis and put them into rice. 40% of the world's calories come from rice. Let's make rice better using the genes that make the orange stuff in carrots. Sure, love it. And so they did this, and they did it in 1999. Here we are 24 years later and still just starting to get out. It was just approved in the Philippines for growth last year. This year will be grown in Bangladesh. And, it wasn't perfect.
Is it used in the United States?
No, we don't use it here. It's
because we don't need it.
We don't need it. We have plenty of vitamin A. This is for the developing world. And
right.
Vitamin A problem, when you're vitamin A deficient, you lose your vision. And then you lose your immune system. You usually die of some sort of chronic diarrhea. And it's a horrible way to go that doesn't have to happen.
And you were saying that it also affects that deficiency normally gets young people, right?
It's very prevalent, and the symptoms are highly prevalent in young people. And teams of workers will go into small villages throughout the world, and they'll put a few drops of vitamin A and some oil on their tongue. And that just a little few drops is enough to give them vitamin A for 6 months. But if you go into Yemen as a Western worker, or places in Pakistan or Afghanistan as a Western healthcare worker, people will take their children and go and run and go inside because the rumors go around that they're spreading poisons from the West. They don't trust us to do the right thing, and understandably. So what if we could allow their farmers to grow the food that has this vitamin in it? And that it just makes so much sense to me. And that's the beginning. Also zinc and iron and protein, many other things that are deficient. We have the ability to replace, and we should do it.
Yeah, and it can be as simple as making it taste better, right? Is that because I think that's for example, with the corn example, right? We can make it more juicy or more flavorful or whatever, right? It can be as simple as that. But since I mentioned this is controversial, like there's of course the other side. So what, in your view, what are the negative things about genetically engineering organisms?
Well, in terms of legitimate risks, so if we look at risk and benefit, we have not seen any evidence of a health problem from genetic engineering or ingredients from genetically engineered crops. Just hasn't happened. And it shouldn't. We're looking at products that we understand, such as this little insecticidal protein, which organic farmers have put on crops for years. It's called BT. They use it in a product called Dipel. We also have herbicide resistance, which confers resistance to a low toxicity herbicide called glyphosate or glufosinate.
Okay.
And the virus resistance. Those are the three main traits that have been engineered in. So no health impacts from the genetic engineering. We do see in the environmental realm consequences in the planet because
Before you go into that, we'll get into environmental. Let's do the health thing because I think it really is one of the things that people can be most afraid of, right? Like when they explain this technology, it's like, oh, we're passing this gene from even a carrot to this rice, and people would say, "Oh, but that's not as you mentioned, right? Like the words that you use is like it's not technically supposed to be there, right? Like people do have, I guess, this like emotional reaction of like, well, if it's not supposed to be there, like maybe something could be going on wrong in there, right? Like maybe what happens if that uh, inclusion of the extra gene makes some biological thing that I don't understand, and then it'll do something harmful for me, right? So what would you say to that person?
no, I understand that concern. But here's two thoughts: is that those genes are there; they're just not turned on at a high level. So the rice does make beta carotene; it just doesn't make it in the endosperm of the rice, the part that we eat. But the plants make plenty of beta carotene in the leaves, and so the gene is there. It's just not turned on at the right
Right,
amount.
but not maybe in this specific example, right? But in other
But
examples
but
that
but it's the same
yeah,
thing. I
yeah.
mean, it's the fear of the unknown. But
Right.
here's the thing: is that the unknown is pretty limited because you can test the plant for what's different in terms of its gene expression, what's different in terms of its metabolism, what's different in terms of the chemistry aboard the rice. Is the rice, the final product, equivalent whether you have this alteration or not, except for beta carotene and ultimately vitamin A?
Right, and
And,
yeah, exactly, and we can test this, right? It's
we
like
can test it.
you can look, and it's like, is it the same one? Is it the same one after you made the thing? Maybe there's some process there that we don't know, but then we can test it, right?
That's right.
Like we can just see, it's like, oh, is it the same rice plus this extra thing? And we can even test, as you're saying, the metabolism. We can also test the people, right?
That's right.
What I guess people would say is like, oh, what about like the long term? Well, not long term. I'm not sure how to phrase it. It's
No,
like
you're right.
the long term effects that could be wrong, right? Like what happens if I eat this and then in like 40 years something happens to me, right?
Yeah, but we hear that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And what it goes back to is a question of plausibility. Is there any plausible reason why you would have something happen out of the blue 40 years later? And there's really not. And and if you applied that same standard to traditionally bred crops, or we're just mixing this one and this one, we wouldn't eat because we can't say that we didn't do something deleterious when we combine two things together. We know that traditional breeding has produced celery varieties which could not be marketed because they had such high concentration of anti-insect compounds from the celery itself, not genetic engineering,
Mm-hmm.
but just plants protect themselves all the time with anti-insect compounds. The levels in celery were so high that the workers would get broken out on their arms and you couldn't sell the celery. There was a potato that would have high levels of something called solamine, which is another dangerous alkaloid. It's a toxic compound. That this potato was an outstanding potato towards insects, but it was dangerous for people to consume. That came through traditional breeding, not tested, no oversight, no regulation, and could have gone into the food supply.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And nobody asks about long-term effects.
Mm-hmm.
But if you change one gene in a way that you understand and you can test and monitor, people get nervous.
Mm-hmm.
I'm exactly the opposite.
Yeah, and as you're saying that there's organizations independent from the people doing the engineering that are testing these things, right? I think you've mentioned like the Food and Drug Administration, USDA, all of these uh, other entities that are like, oh, let's see if what these people are doing are really, if what these people are claiming is really the case, right? And that's kind of like the idea of science, right?
Right. Well, these organizations like FDA and USDA, EPA, they don't do any of the research themselves. What they do is they sit with a company that wants to release a product and they say, here are the tests we need to see.
Mm.
And then the company goes and gets those data. And then they can contract out to independent entities to double check it.
Right.
But they bring that data back to the EPA, FDA, and everything and see what's there. And a lot of people think that's not a good thing because, you're giving the company that wants to release it
The power to do the testing and
the
all
job
of
to
that.
do the testing.
Right.
But at the same time, should the taxpayer be paying for research on a company's private product?
Yeah.
So what you really do is you trust and verify. You have companies that are producing a product that if it doesn't perform as it should, farmers won't buy it.
Right.
And if it starts, if you see people who are getting sick, you'd figure it out right away.
Yeah, and as you can say, you can definitely, as a USDA or FDA, you can say to the companies, well, don't do it yourself. Use an independent contractor to do the testing to double check. Even like you do the testing, they do the testing. Let's see if the results are the same, right?
Well, and the funny part is the USDA or the FDA, they don't have to even request that of a company. A company is, before they even get a product to go for approval, they've done all the testing. You don't spend the money and the time as a business chasing something that's not correct. You verify it in-house, you verify it out of house, you trial it on thousands of farms before you release it. You make sure the farmers are happy with it. You make sure it's the products are equivalent. You do everything. And then you go to the FDA and say, okay, what do you need us to do? We got something we like here. We're going to put it through deregulation. And I think that is something that gives me a lot of comfort. The idea that companies, it is so expensive to put out a new drug or a new plant variety that companies don't screw around.
Yeah, because even if you mess it up, there's most likely some kind of repercussion, right? Like for the company, like financially, right? Right. If you mess up and you put in or you request something that then it later turned out it was not correct, or even before the product, right? Like you're doing this test and then somebody tests your thing and they say, oh, this is doing some type of harm. As you're saying, like you lost all of that money spent into doing all of the research and development, all of that, which costs a lot of money, I imagine. And that is something you don't want as a company, right? So like that profit seeking motive can work, at least in those cases, in these situations, right? How do you think that could fail? Like, for example, there's people that say, okay, you have these companies then, but what if they are the only ones that have access to this thing? Like the monopolization issue, right? It's like, and there can be many issues with that, right? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, you're thinking about in terms of patent protection of specific genes or specific seed lines, that kind of thing. Is that what you're going for?
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, I think you've talked about this already. A specific case where you had like companies. It was some I don't remember exactly, but was it like some rice that you had some seed and the seed or you couldn't replant it, you had to like go through a company?
Well, let's talk about what that is. Okay, so companies years ago, when they started to develop these lines, they said, we got two ways we can handle this. We've got some improved corn here that's going to make you a lot of money. And so we added a gene that costs a lot of money to make it. So we got to recoup our losses. The way we're going to do this is one of two ways. We're either going to sell you this bag of seeds for $160,000 and you can do whatever you want with it from here on out, or every year you pay a little extra for the seed, or actually a lot extra for the seed. Instead of $25 a bag, pay $100 a bag, and there's a licensing fee, and you agree to not propagate it. And most farmers are pretty happy to do that anyway, because it's something like corn you can't propagate anyway because it's a hybrid, and a strange maternal plant, a strange father plant, they come together and the offspring are would not match anything and be completely unpredictable. As a farmer, you want predictability. Soy and canola maybe are things that are highly inbred that you could potentially
make more for yourself, right?
But farmers are out there to generate the food and the product from the field. They're not there to raise seed, which is a whole different science, a whole different art form, requires whole different equipment. And it's always the myth that a farmer, well, we want to save our own seeds. Most farmers want to get fresh seeds from the company every year. That's really where it comes from, because that way the company's liable. You know the company, you know the seeds are good. They're usually grown in Hawaii or somewhere where it's Puerto Rico, somewhere where it's dry and warm.
That is true, because that's a great point. Like if you're a farmer and you're experimenting with your crops and then you're giving it to thousands of people, if something goes wrong, people are gonna go to you,
Yeah.
right? It's like, oh, what you were experimenting, or tell me exactly what you did, what messed it up. It's like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. I'll just buy the things for the company. That's a great point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Well, or if you plant your own seeds, let's just say you brown bag your own seeds and put them in your own farm and put them in the soil, and they don't germinate because you didn't store them correctly. Now you need to get seeds, and you can't get them from the big companies, because if you're trying to put them in the ground in 2023, they're taking orders for 2024 already. So you need to make sure that you've got good seed. And if my wife is a farmer, and we put seeds in, we can't afford to plant twice. So we plant one time with the best seed. We can't afford to have 50% of them come up. We need to have 100%. And so we trust a seed company to give us seeds, or we buy the best seeds.
Yeah. As a small aside, I think I heard you say farmers are one of the most kick-ass jobs.
Absolutely.
Just explain that as a small aside.
Did I say the most
What-
kick-ass job?
Something like that. It was like that you really have a lot of respect for farmers.
Tons
right?
of respect for
Right.
farmers. As a molecular biologist, I get to sit in an office every day and take care of some stuff. I do experiments, I write papers, I train students. But farmers, you are battling against nature to grow a crop where it doesn't belong and produce a product that consumers are buzzing on social media saying is going to kill them. I mean, think about this for a minute. And it's hard work. You might break even every year, and and if you have a combine breakdown and require $80,000 in repairs, which is not uncommon, it's a very hard job and very difficult to make ends meet, make a profit. The commodity prices are low, and it's extremely challenging. Weather is unpredictable. You can have a dry year one year with no water, no crop. You get next year floods, no crop. An insect moves in that you didn't anticipate, you got to spend a lot of money on insecticide. There are so many things that farmers push back against, and huge respect for them.
Yeah. We'll go back to the genetically engineered organism. So like other concerns that people have is the environmental one that you were saying, right? And the environmental, because I had, for example, the super weeds that, like the super weeds issue that basically you can most definitely explain it better than me, but it's, as you mentioned, you have this plant and you make it so that it's resistant to weeds, right? Or to the pesticide that you spray to kill the weeds.
Yeah.
Then when you spray the pesticide, most of the weeds die. But as we mentioned before, there might be a couple of weeds that will be left, right? And those which means that those weeds are tougher to that specific pesticide. So what happens if you keep doing that? The tougher weeds, which is harmful for your plants, then gets to spread. And yeah, so how would you navigate that? I guess you would just tackle it in different stages of the development, right?
No, I think you got a good take on that there. The technology is such that you put a gene into a plant that allows you to use an herbicide and not kill it. It's actually a really simple thing metabolically. We could talk about it, but it's pretty simple. It's a natural occurring enzyme. Anyway, long story short is the farmer plants the seeds germinate, the weeds germinate. Then you go over the top with the spray, which in generally is a very low risk spray. It kills the weeds, leaves the plants. The plants keep growing. They crowd out the weeds, shade the weeds that don't germinate. And now you've got a clean field that produces the crop. The herbicide is long gone. There's no herbicide around. You did that early. You picked the crop late. Good stuff, right? The problem is evolution. You get a couple of plant genetics are always mixing.
Mm-hmm.
You get the one weed that can grow through it, and now this new weed can set seeds that will grow in the field. And that is the problem. It's because we've relied on one strategy against the weeds. What we should have done, what I said we should have done in 1995, was have multiple strategies. Before you release one, you have multiple ones. And then you treat with this one this year, this one this year, this one this year, this one year. Because if you've got a 1 in a billion chance of becoming a resistant weed, the odds of getting 2 genetic changes in that weed are pretty low. So if it grows the next year, you kill it with a different herbicide.
Right.
And they're starting to do that now.
That is pretty cool. Yeah, it's just basically like trying to be smarter than the weed,
Yeah.
and trying to reduce the possibility of those super weeds as close to zero as possible, because it would never be zero, right? But as close as you can get, so it's very, very, very unlikely that you get some weed that is resistant to all the things that you're using to attack it.
Yeah. And you know, and I don't like the term super weed very much because
Gotcha.
they're not that super. They're just resistant to one chemistry.
Okay.
But it does make a difference.
Right.
And it is
Right.
it is a very, very strong environmental concern because farmers don't have any way to control the weeds, and they go, well, forget it then. We're not going to use genetic engineered seeds anymore. And in fact, we're going back to old technologies or older herbicides that have much higher environmental and impact and occupational risk. And so that's why we've been able to, that's why it's such a concern for me. In the insect resistant crops, we see resistance to the insects being resistant to the strategy. And that's really bad because this works really well in crops. And then on the island of Hawaii, you find the crops that make the virus resistance producing pollen that's escaping and crossing into non-genetic engineered populations. So organic farmers are now finding genetically engineered papayas on their space, which grow great, but they don't necessarily want that, and they can't sell their food as organic because it has a transgene, it has this foreign gene in there. And it's a dumb rule, but that is the rule, and it affects their bottom line as farmers. So there are a lot of effects that happen because environmentally, genetic engineering has consequences.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to talk on those two because those are really interesting. One was a little bit more on the environmental impact. So, what are the concerns that people have in this environmental? Because I kind of get it. Of, as you were mentioning, you have this genetically engineered organism that then goes in the wild, like for some reason, and then, for example, with this specific example you were saying, maybe it kills more of that insect than what you wanted outside of your crops. And then what happens if that insect then starts dying more than what it's normally been dying? Then it affects, I don't know, the bird that was eating that insect, right? And something like that. Is that?
I think that's not a concern. I understand what you're saying.
Right.
You know, creating kind of a, kick the snowball down the hill and it gets bigger and bigger. I think it happens the opposite. I think what they've actually shown is by switching from an airplane spraying a broad spectrum herbicide or insecticide over a field to the plant producing an insecticide that when the insect bites it, dies. You now have more biodiversity in those fields than ever before. And that the ones that are dying from biting the crop, it only works if the farmer also plants a crop that is not resistant. Because you have a natural population that if a gene resistance develops, it can dilute in that natural area. So these ideas of somehow having bioengineered plants skew the gene pool, not a big problem that we've seen, and actually quite the opposite.
So it would be, because what exactly are you referring with, like changing the gene pool? Is it like, because how I think about it is kind of like the ecosystem, right? I'm not sure if that's actually a technical term of, like, normally you have this population of birds and insects and plants or whatever, and changing like the proportions of those would be changing the ecosystem. So
Yeah.
is that a concern, as you were saying? Or basically, you explained.
And I understand that too, but I think if you want to stop that, it's not genetic engineering that's the problem. It would be farming is the problem, because we're converting farmland into cropland. And we're
Okay.
converting prairies into cropland. We're converting forests into cropping land. And all right, I understand that is a thing. We've got to eat. We got to fill the population.
Right.
But this is my concern going forward if we shun technology. Because if we say technology is, we don't want it, get rid of it, we're going to need more land to do it. And we're going to then invade more ecosystems. Farming is an artificial human process. You know, this isn't, you don't have a cornfield growing in the middle of Iowa, in nature. This was a product that came from Mexico that humans found value in and found ways to grow lots of. So farming is an artificial construct that impinges on nature, and therefore we have to protect nature, we need to constrain farming, meaning we need to produce more stuff on the land we have, which means every technology in the book to make it happen.
Which would mean reducing the amount, or reducing, for example, all the cutting of the Amazon forest that people always say is like that they're destroying the Amazon forest to do all of this agriculture. Of course, they might be people might be doing it for different reasons than agriculture, right? It's another issue. Doesn't have to do with agriculture, but within agriculture, then what would be a good solution is then, well, within the area that you have, well, as you were saying, get more food out of it, right? Which makes complete sense. Let's touch on the other thing that you mentioned, I think some legal issues, because you were saying that the farmers then got this genetically engineered organism in their crops that were supposed to be organic, and then they cannot sell it as organic. Is that... Yeah, and you said it was not a great idea. Why did you say it was not a great idea?
Well, I think I said that the not being able to sell organic crops with a transgene, I think that's where I was.
Okay, exactly.
So if there's
exactly.
evidence of genetic engineering, it's not allowed in organic production, which I think is insane.
Okay.
Because the goal is exactly the same. And if you have corn that is resistant to an insect, so in the organic farm, you put dipel on, which is BT.
Okay.
And
is that a pesticide?
That's the pesticide,
Okay.
the natural pesticide that comes from bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
You put dipel on the plant, and the plant lives, and the insect dies. In genetic engineering, you take the plant and tell the plant make that protein, and then you don't need to apply anything. The plant grows, makes its own protection. Both of them use the same molecule to protect them. One you have to apply; it costs money. If you're doing a large operation, it takes labor and diesel and everything else. And if the rain comes, it washes it off. Over here, the plant makes it. And if the rain comes, it makes more. There's no diesel and there's no labor. To me, this is what the organic grower needs.
Right.
You need the crop because you need to make a profit. You don't want to apply synthetic chemistry.
Yeah.
So let the plant make a natural product.
I guess I was just gonna ask you what exactly do people mean when they say organic, but I imagine that's its own rabbit hole.
No,
Really?
I can be brief. It basically means that it's a production system that does not rely on synthetic pesticides or herbicides or pesticides or fertilizers.
Okay.
So you can't use anything synthetic. You can use natural. So you can, which is where it gets funny. You can use natural nitrogen from compost.
Okay.
But you can't use nitrogen obtained from the Haber-Bosch process, which fixes nitrogen into ammonia or other nitrogen-containing compounds.
Right.
So, which the plants
like the air,
from the air, usually within the presence of natural gas. It is a fossil fuel intensive process. But does the plant know it's nitrogen, or does the plant know it's nitrogen?
Okay.
It can't tell.
Right.
So
right.
what really matters is, what is best for the farmer. And when organic farmers can get a higher price, great, do it organically. But conventional farmers, you make more, sell it for less. So.
And is that connected to the labeling issue? Because and explain to me what the issue was, because I really I kind of saw it and it was like, oh, I'll just let him explain it.
No, the labeling issue is an awful one. That comes really from the long time where people say, well, we don't want this technology and I don't want to eat anything from it because I'm afraid of the food. And then you had people saying it causes cancer and it causes autism and it causes your children to have this disease and you to get this disease and you to get, and none of that is true. It's been shown none of it is true. All the people who said it are liars, and it was then and it is now. What they said was, well, because all of this risk, which isn't true, we need to have a label. And what they called
GMO.
a GMO with a big skull and crossbones right on the front of the label.
Oh, interesting. I haven't seen that.
Oh no,
I have to check it out.
Well, this is what they were going for.
Because there's the items that you buy in the grocery store that says non-GMO, right? So it's kind of like a bag. Exactly. So okay, so it's completely different.
That's the other way around. What they were pushing for in 2012 in Proposition 40, 30, whatever it was in California, was a label that would say this is GMO, and right on the front, and it didn't pass, but it almost did. And if California would have passed it, the rest of the country would have had to have adopted it because you can't segregate. This food is for California. This is for everybody.
Right.
This label is for California. This is for everyone else.
California is a big economy.
It's a big economy, the biggest economy in the world. And so the issue became, what is this going to cost the consumer to protect us from nothing? There's no added risk. The sugar that comes from a genetically engineered sugar beet is chemically identical to the one that comes from a normal, conventional, or an organic sugar beet. So what are we protecting ourselves from with this label? So luckily science prevailed. We were able to get through that. But then things like the non-GMO project, they said, well, if you're not going to label it, we're going to label it the other way.
Right.
So they came up with a product which is so disingenuous because they'll say like, well, here is our non-GMO hummus. Well, there was no genetically engineered chickpeas. There's no genetically engineered corn. What else is in hummus? Sesame oil, tahini. None of that's genetic. You can't buy a GMO. So to label it as non-GMO, it's all non-GMO. So it's a way of
just because it's the specific ingredients that are in hummus. But like, how about would you have the non-GMO rice, for example, and people would sell it as non-GMO rice?
Well, they sell non-GMO rice, but there's no rice that was ever made there's no genetically engineered rice on the market except for golden rice in the Philippines.
Okay.
So in the United States, you can't buy GMO rice, but you could go to the grocery store and see a package that says non-GMO project rice at a higher cost. And the people in that non-GMO company, they're making money by
labeling, right?
By a label that pushes a false concept.
Right.
And I think it's really disingenuous.
Yeah, and as we were saying, just the term GMO doesn't really mean like as you were saying, like people that, and I imagine there's corn that it says non-GMO, right?
There's a lot. It's like a real estate agent putting a sign on a house saying not haunted.
Okay.
They'll say here's one extra selling point. I guarantee there's no ghosts in the house. Well, some people who are afraid of this are going to say, well, all right, I'm going to buy that. That's great.
I'm going to buy the higher price for the house.
We're going to pay a little extra to make sure there's no ghosts in there.
Right.
And those of us who are more scientifically minded say, well, we know there's no such thing. No one's ever shown evidence of such things. That's kind of silly. And if someone's willing to pay more for it, well, that's on them. But my job as a scientist in the public is to say, let me hold your hand and walk you through this ghost problem you have. and the same with genetic engineering. I like to help people not be fooled into paying more money for something that's not necessary.
Right. And you mentioned that there's this group that was pushing for the labeling. Could you explain to me, like, what exactly are these groups and what are their motivations? Like, why are they doing what they're doing? It's
hard to say. A lot of them have environmental concerns. And the foundation of this was that the companies that were making the seeds, the first genetically engineered seeds, were Monsanto, Dow, Syngenta, Bayer, and these are all companies that over the last 100 years have not had the best records of environmental stewardship. You can find Superfund sites with a big Monsanto cleanup sign on them, and companies have been penalized. Dow bought Union Carbide that in the 1980s, I think it was, sent a gas cloud over a city in India that killed 2,300 people. There's a lot of tragedy in these companies. So now they're saying, well, we're chemical companies, but you know what? We're going to start manufacturing seeds to make commodity food. A lot of people took that very negatively, and a lot of the environmental concerns around this were born at that time. And it became very easy to say, here's a company that poisoned the earth. They're making the seeds. They're probably going to poison you too. And that kind of relationship was very hard to shake, especially when the companies and all of this was happening at the birth of the internet. And the companies said, we're not getting involved. The farmer buys our seeds. They like them. That's good enough. The other folks said to the consumer, you're going to get poisoned by the seeds from these evil companies. These Frankenfoods will get you. And it just was the perfect storm. And it allowed a lot of suspicion and a lot of curiosity around the food and the products themselves that turned out not to be true.
That is fascinating. So, would you say it's kind of like, well, I was gonna talk about the users, but like the users now, well, even the group, these types of groups, is like, oh, these companies has been associated doing these bad things. They're a big evil company. They'll do big evil things with this new enterprise. Would you characterize it more than as like fear or anger towards corporations? Just corporations as a whole, like the way that their system works.
Yeah, and there's a big part. There's a big part of that, and I agree with that. I understand that. I hate my freaking car company and my bank. I have to pay a cell phone bill every month. Heck with them. I understand that 100%. And the problem is ironic in that there's been consolidation in the seed industry. That in the 1990s, the Monsanto company bought 600 little tiny seed companies. I used to ride a bike in Illinois, and I'd see all the different seed kinds out in the field. And they were all bought up by basically 6 big companies that eventually condensed down to 4 big companies. And the problem is that the regulatory hoops are so high and so onerous that the big companies are the only ones that can navigate it. And they like it that way because now there's no competition. And the more the anti-GMO people say, make it harder to regulate, make it stronger regulation, more legal hurdles to jump, the big companies go, okay, we'll play that game.
Yeah, because we have the money to play the game.
We got the money, we got legal expertise, we got the science, and then it takes the small companies that could be their competitors out. So if you're I blame consolidation on high regulation. And that's the beauty of the new types of genetic engineering, the stuff we call gene editing, this CRISPR-Cas9 stuff. This is democratizing the science where small companies, institutions like the University of Florida, where governments can get into the ball game, where small companies, small governments in the developing world can now play in that science world. They're very good.
So, for example, and now that we have these companies that are getting into this new technologies, they're trying to in some way like make their reputations good again, right? Like appeal to the public, and like what they're doing is sound. So like what is their influence in the research that's happening in the universities? For example, you said they have the money, so like what would be stopping them to just say all this, or let's make research into only the aspects that are beneficial to us, right? Like how's that relationship in your view, and like how that plays out?
It's hard to say. I know a lot of companies do have, the big companies have significant research contracts with most universities many universities, mostly in the Midwest where these crops are sold, right? Like your Illinois, Iowa, all that stuff. A lot of Monsanto and Dow and Syngenta money go there. University of Florida, a little bit comes here. There's some folks here who do some work in crops that matter to them, but that's because university research is a good value. And depending upon the researcher, I always have the stipulation that we have to be able to publish the work. And sometimes a company will say, well, we don't want it published, so we're not going to do work with you. That's happened before. So
they want to keep the intellectual property.
Well, they have to keep it all under the hood.
Mm-hmm.
Now, other times they may fund a technician who can do the work under your supervision, and the dollars allow the laboratory to hire somebody or something. But in general, it's not necessarily. It's only a good deal for the university if it's for the benefit of the professors in the currencies we use, which is papers, grants, collaboration, training, extension. If I can learn something that I can teach somebody in our state, that's great. But in general, that's why they don't do so much work with University of Florida.
Okay.
We're funded by state industries like citrus and strawberry and blueberry, that kind of thing.
Yeah. But how about like in maybe not University of Florida, but like in general? Because I can see the concern of like people saying, oh, maybe these big companies, as you were saying, that they have the money, they can influence somehow the research that's being done so that the research like is aligned with what their financial motivations are.
Yeah, I understand that. So people make that allegation all the time, and there's a couple of points. First, people who work in universities who choose to be professors in an education, there's a level of integrity there because you would make more money in industry if you wanted to just do the party line.
For
you
sure.
get into this because this is about education, about discovery, and a company, pulling your strings to get you to do something the company wants isn't going to happen. I'm sure it does, but it's very unlikely. I'm not going to be naive enough to say that they can't influence a decision, but it's unlikely.
Yeah, as you were saying, like normally the people that tend to choose these kinds of jobs are a little bit more likely to not be influenced by those corporations and just do the research that they want to do.
Yeah, but so the reason that allegation comes up is what we talked about earlier. A company comes out with a new product. They have a new widget. And they test that widget internally, and they know it does what a widget does, and they know it's very widgety, and they know it's safe, and they do all the work they do on it, and then they say, you know what, before we get to patent, let's get an independent verification. And they send it to the laboratory at University of Hawaii, and they do the research, and they show that it's widgety safe and an excellent widget. It's because they already knew that going in, and they just were using an outsider to verify and maybe come up with any other nuances that they may find. So most of the work that's going to the university has already been done. Universities just verify. The other part of it is that if a university takes that widget and finds out it fails, it's dangerous, it doesn't work, it doesn't get published. It gets thrown in the garbage and they move on.
But couldn't they publish it as, oh, this new thing that we try? Yeah, I guess it's not normally the thing that happens.
There's not much. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, but it's hard to publish negative data.
Yeah.
And so when people say, well, the only research reports are favorable for the company, it's because you can't publish negative data. Why would you want to? Hey, guess what? This didn't work. Well, add it to the locker of failed dreams.
And I'm guessing, in your opinion, would you say they should be doing a little bit more of that? Like, there should be a little bit more of a culture and system in place so that people can publish negative data, right?
Well, I wish there was.
Right.
I'd have a lot more publication. I mean, most of what we do fails, right? Right. But your failures inform your successes, and in my laboratory, I think over the last 20 years, or maybe more than that, probably 25 years, that I went into a hypothesis test with a rigorous test to figure out what's going on, and found out that the data didn't support what I thought. And the average person goes, well, then you failed. And I go, no, I succeeded.
Exactly.
I tested it with a really stringent test and found out that I was underthinking this, that the problem is much more interesting than I made it.
Right,
And it
right.
actually turned out to be a much, much more cool project that opened up new research avenues, brought in lots more funding money. Good thing.
And that is really hard to communicate, right? Because you have to be doing the work to really get this, or at least it's more likely, right? Like what I'm trying to say is like, as a science communicator yourself, it's I guess you understand the struggle of communicating these nuances to people, right? Like how do you navigate that of like these complicated topics that, for example, this uh or like even how to navigate bad science, right? Like
Sure.
for example, it's like maybe this paper was not a great paper because it was not controlling for random, like did not a control
Yeah.
set group, right? Like those nuances that, how do you communicate that? Like is it just like explain the whole science process, or it's like
Well, but here's the thing, and there are cases of bad science and
mm-hmm,
disingenuous science, in cases where people on purpose did something deceptive or malicious. It happens very rarely. But the way I explain it is, I don't think there are bad reports. I think every report has strengths and limitations. And when we look at a scientific study, you can sit and always recommend more research. You can always find something wrong. The point is, what you say is you say, I say, here's what I really like about this paper, and here's the place where the authors could have thought about it a little bit more. The problem that we have is this: the authors, in some cases, will overinterpret or extend the data beyond where they should extend. So they find 1 plus 1 equals 2. Well, maybe the authors will say, well, if it equals 1 plus 1 equals 2, it's possible that it may equal 3. And then someone will read that paper and say 1 plus 1 equals 3. And then the New York Times says 1 plus 1 equals 3. And now the cat's out of the bag, and Facebook says we've been doing it wrong all along. You have to be able to look at the strengths and weaknesses of how they did those data and how they did those tests. And that's the problem we have as a communication problem.
mm-hmm.
We allow scientists to speculate a little bit, as we should. Then those speculations are blown out of proportion by a media that's looking for sensationalism. And then that flies through social media. The original scientist that made the discovery says, wait a minute, that's not what I said. But too late. It's already made CNN.
So how would, or what are tips that you would give to researchers, or solutions that you would apply yourself to this issue? Like, do you have specific solutions other than just communicate how the process is and slowly lay them out? Because what I'm worried about at this, like, I super agree with all you said, but what I am personally worried is like people don't have the bandwidth for all these kinds of stuff, right? Uh, like me, that it's like more mechanical engineering. I think of myself like as a sciencey person, right? But I don't understand almost anything about like biology, like cell, microbiology, cells, and all of that stuff. So like spending the time and listen to the arguments and all of that stuff would really be time consuming. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's really difficult. It's really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a short-term solution and a long-term solution. And the long-term solution is we need to change the way we educate people.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to understand that every piece of information, every piece of data that you need is on your stupid cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need to know is, how do you tell real from fake? How do you tell what's reliable? How do we interpret it within the bounds and limits of the data and the statistical support that it has? And how do we put it together? How do we synthesize it into the models and with the scientific consensus? How does it all fit together? That's what we have to teach more. And I think I've changed my teaching style a lot in the last 20 years because of that.
Okay.
But that's the long-term solution, is revising the way we teach to fit this construct. The short-term way is communication. And it's helping people understand this is how the process works, and here's what the data really says, and here's what you can trust, and here's what you shouldn't. Here's what here are the strengths and here are the limitations. The strengths are they tried a novel approach to do this. The limitations are they only did a small number of individuals. Maybe it's not right, but we can design the next more rigorous test with more individuals and a whole lot more money that hopefully they can get because they got results from that first study. So the idea of science being a process and building and being a consensus and informing each other, that's where this really needs to be.
And it's wonderful because I never heard you say anything about authority, which is something that sometimes bothers me of people say. And yeah, and not to take on you personally, but I've heard you say, and of, for example, like, listen to the scientists, which I know is useful, but I can, for example, picture the person that says, oh, you take this science label and this thing as an authority, right? And then you're just appealing to that authority. And then people say, oh, well, then I see in this other situation where the same authority messed it up.
Yeah.
So are you just not telling me what the accurate information is? So yeah, what would be your opinions in that? Because
yeah,
and just the first thing that you said was really terrific. Yeah.
Well, but there's two parts to that. The first is on the side of the consumer of science, needs to love their experts and identify their experts and embrace their experts. Experts are wonderful. I count on an expert to fly my plane. I count on an expert to fix my plumbing. I count on an expert to do my surgery and my dentistry, fix my car. I don't count on the guy on Facebook to do it. And so why do we trust the person on Facebook to give us the science or to explain the pandemic? Or your aunt, or your sister's crazy friend.
Right.
We need experts, and we have to understand who those experts are. That's step one. The other side is we need experts to be better. And you don't need to look farther than Dr. Fauci and others who ways that you can screw up communication around an important issue to completely blow your trust.
Right.
And when you lose the trust, now everything's off.
Yeah.
And because they don't just trust you, they distrust all of the science, they distrust all of the evidence. So we need to find ways to earn trust as experts and then become the trusted experts in the places where people are finding their news and information, which is in social media.
Right. Because I do agree that you need some sort of trust, right? Because at the end, what I was saying, that people really don't have the time to do their own research, right? Like, or maybe their own research has been very misused, right? But you can say people don't have the time to be experts in everything, right? I cannot be expert in like biotechnology and cells and all of that stuff. So I have to somehow rely on people for me that know what they're doing. And hopefully for me to really trust that person because what they're saying makes some sense. Yeah.
But that's why scientists need to stop worrying about talking about what they do and how they do it. They have to talk about why they do it. You have to say, I want to solve a problem with food insecurity in the developing world. I care about those kids that are vitamin A deficiency, and it bothers me every night that someone doesn't have enough food to eat. And I can come up with solutions in the laboratory to fix that using genetic engineering. And someone who's skeptical of genetic engineering is saying, I'm right there with you. I didn't have to talk about the 35S cauliflower mosaic virus driving the bacterially derived gene for beta carotene synthesis. I talk about the areas that we both believe in, what we both want. What's the thing that puts us together? What are our values that are common? And if we talk about those things, we make progress. And this is where science communication has failed, is it went into burying people in details and not talking about trust, not building trust. And I can change someone's mind in a grocery store around a food question in 2 seconds just by
talking to them,
earning trust.
Yes.
And I don't need to talk about details.
Right.
And I do it all the time. The other day on Facebook, I don't remember the issue, it was maybe around mRNA vaccines in livestock. And someone said, I've never thought about it that way before. Thank you. And this was in like a Facebook thing. So it just is getting out as a scientist, earning trust, and changing minds.
Right. Oh my God. I was going to ask something about that. I completely forgot. I was going to say, yeah, for example, no, I forgot it. I'm just going to ask another question. Regarding that, what happens when people that you, or what is the process of the system when people that you're trying to trust for this have disagreements, right? For example, when I say, okay, let me place my trust in like these institutions, these people, what happens when they have disagreements is like, oh, what do I do now? Like, how would you navigate that as yourself, like as a consumer, and also as a scientist? Like, how do you navigate that disagreement?
Yeah, and that's a tricky question. So when two experts disagree, two trusted experts disagree, it suggests
Right.
there's more nuance that there is yet to be discovered,
Yeah.
and both of them should agree on that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
if two people have,
Yeah.
here's my evidence and here's my evidence, and I'm going to believe my stuff and not your stuff. That's
Right.
that's when people say let's agree to disagree. I'll always say, well, no, let's agree to agree, and just convince me how I'm wrong, and I'm good.
Right.
The problem is that people dig in their heels and they're adverse to changing their minds
Mm-hmm.
when confronted with evidence that is counter to their opinion, and they actually dig in a little bit further. We have to be open to change,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to go into every situation, say, here's maybe why I'm wrong, or maybe I'm wrong, convince me. And I do this all the time online, and I'll say, show me where I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And people can't do it. They back out of the conversation. But it's that idea of the humility of saying, maybe I'm wrong, show me, or let's test the hypothesis together. Let's
Right.
think about this
It
together.
really is kind of like a battle of ideas, right? It shouldn't be like a battle of persons or you associating yourself to an idea. Like, it's like, oh, I have this belief. You can challenge it as much as you can, and whatever will emerge hopefully will be better for
Yeah.
both of us, right?
So it's not about being right.
Mm-hmm.
It's about being not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of nuance in that equation. What it says is that when you have someone you disagree with, it shouldn't be a question of two people saying, well, we're just going to agree to disagree. It should be, show me why I'm wrong. Let's share my evidence. You share your evidence. Let's figure out what it is, and then let's go get a pizza and call it a day. That's how we should solve our disputes.
Right.
The problem is that people get into entrenched camps that they can't get out of, because they would get kicked out of the club. They get kicked out of the online group or whatever, that their friends might abandon them, that they wouldn't no longer belong there. I'm no longer a vegan because I ate with this. There's people
Which is definitely like a reasonable concern, right? But you can navigate those. Like, there's nuance there. Like, you don't have to lose your friend. You can explain to them, to your friends, right? Like, oh, this is why I believe in what we're doing before is not correct. Right?
and see the cultural and social ramifications of disagreeing with your tribe are very severe.
Hate it, yeah.
And so if you're in your social group and you decide that, well, wait a minute, I've been shopping at Whole Foods, I'm getting screwed on this stuff. I'm gonna start going to Publix and Albertsons or whatever. When you now your friends who are very well, oh, wait a minute, you're going to eat all those pesticides, and you're going to
Right.
and it starts to cause conflict inside our social groups that is just uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And as a scientist, I like that. I like challenging. I've got neighbors and friends who I politically disagree with, who I always just say the
Right.
most potent words in the human language of help me understand. And so, like, I'll say, help me understand how you think this is a good idea. And how do you think this is going on? Why do you think we did this? And I will generate those controversies and debates, because I love that. That's how I learn more. Show me how I'm wrong, and I'm good with that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go get pizza. And that's the island we should be working towards as a nation. I could heal this
As
nation.
a humanity, right? Like, because for sure, it doesn't have to be the whole U.S. Like, it's definitely like an international problem that we should be striving towards.
Well, it's a social issue. Like, why do we have to be right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is what the infection of social media is. People, well, you're an idiot, you're wrong. It's like, well, I guess I can see your point, but maybe if we think of it this way, how do we need to have those nuanced conversations. Social media and its anonymity and its bots and trolls, it's not set up for that.
Discourage that. Yeah.
It thrives on conflict.
It thrives on conflicts. Yeah, so more specifically, like people could just stop putting themselves in those platforms a little bit less, or understand that these platforms do that, right? Like understand that, for example, like a Twitter just builds on conflict.
Okay, but you can use that platform to
Mm-hmm.
build trust.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
this
yeah,
is the beauty part.
absolutely, yeah, yeah,
When you're in the mud pit,
yeah,
the diamond shines.
yeah. I like it.
And so
Yeah,
all you
definitely.
need to do is go to Twitter and be nice. People always say to me, I can't believe you have the patience for these idiots. And it's like, you know what? That idiot isn't my audience. The people watching are my audience. And I get more followers when someone goes after me aggressively, and you work for Monsanto, you're an idiot, and poison everybody. When I respond kindly, I watch the followers number just go like the odometer on a car.
Yeah,
So,
because people do like that. That's a great point. Like people, even though they're participating in like this whole uh, encouraging flames, like people still like that, like disagreements, like what you were saying, right? Like challenge my ideas, tell me when I'm wrong, and if you think I'm stupid or whatever, yeah, like tell me why. Like I want to understand you, and the other people would look at that and it's like, yeah, like I would like to be in that situation. Like I like to behave that way. So I think that's terrific, and yeah, I don't really have anything else to say. That is just
I get
wonderful.
freaking marriage proposals because of how because they go, God, you're just such a nice person,
Right.
because when you handle people like that with tact, when you admit that you could be wrong, when you discuss these things like in that kind way.
Mm-hmm.
There was one woman last week who put something up that I wrote about. I wrote a question about, about, well, here's how I understand it. And she said, oh, no, here's how it is here. I said, oh, I'm sorry. I totally had that wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And she was very,
She's like, whoa.
say, hey, who's this guy? A dude who says he's wrong. First, there's a rare beast. And then, and then she followed me, and I follow her, and I really appreciate her content, and I learn a lot from her, and I trust her.
Gotcha.
She's a nurse, and I just think she's fantastic. And so
Okay.
this was now a relationship that came about because of social media and behaving yourself, and being kind and stepping into something with humility.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And that kind of circles back to the same thing that we're saying, like any technology can be used for bad things and good things, right? So what would you do in that? Just you cannot really, because I really agree with what you were saying of you cannot let the bad consequences of technology stop you from pursuing the good things, right? Like if you have social media and you're not agreeing with all this encouraging flames, then just try to change it somehow, like, or just you yourself be part of the change to discourage the flames.
That's right.
Right. The same with GMOs, right? Like even though, because I think they could potentially be like used for harm, right? Like that shouldn't necessarily be the reason why you would stop pursuing this, because of all the good things that you mentioned.
No, I mean, with the equipment in this laboratory, I could manufacture the entire COVID virus tomorrow.
Okay.
I mean, you could too. I could show you in about an hour how to do it. I mean, we download the information, like get going, get cracking. We could go get pizza, come back and have a virus. I mean, it can be done. The thing that stops me from doing it is because it's the wrong thing to do. And so what we're looking at is what is the moral compass of the people that are making these decisions, and technology being just only a tool, and how we implement it is dependent upon this. And we have these conversations around firearms in this country. We have these conversations around everything. Whose responsibility is it to use the technology correctly? And who should be writing the laws about how it's used and how should they be enforced? These are all really important questions that are only going to come at us more fast and more furious. And there's twin girls in China who won't get HIV, who are a great example. He did Lang Hui He did that experiment and way before his time, and in the effort to do something positive that now we don't know how that fits ethically. So very interesting times.
Yeah, and now that you've laid that out, what, having said exactly that, what gives you hope for the future, or what are you grateful for?
Yeah, I think about that a lot because I have a daughter due any day now.
Okay, nice.
And she will grow up probably in a world surrounded by technology. And what is going to be her moral compass? In the olden days, we feared things like, religious retaliation. You're going to fear of hell, if you did something wrong. What is our current state to do that? What is our current guide? What is our, and it really relies on people doing the right thing. And that's why I get a little nervous about things like social media that tend to distort and deceive and maybe pull in ways that are unfair and not correct. And I think this really relies on the bigger social question of, where do we want to be together? Where do we want to be as a people, and how do we want to behave on this planet? And that gets into areas I have no training in, and I just have some good guesses.
Right.
But the way forward, all I can do is try to, my personal feeling is what I can control. How do we get more food and healthy food into more people with less environmental impact? And how do we keep farmers in business? And if we can do all those things, and we have people who aren't hungry, there are people who are trained, people who have medical care, you're less likely to have people who are going to do malicious acts. So it's about getting people okay, caring for others. That's where we need to be.
So what are you grateful for currently?
Oh gosh, don't get me started. You make me cry. I go there all the time. I'm grateful I had the opportunity to do this job, to be a teacher, to be so many things. I mean, it's tough because I got a parent who's not in good shape, but grateful for all the guidance he gave me. Oh, geez. I am very emotional right now with the daughter on the way and a dad who's sick, but he taught me everything about how to fix everything and how to figure things out. And that training goes into everything I do. Grateful for the teachers I had. Grateful for the fact that I was born where I was born. I was born in a country that has resources, in a place where I could go to school and have medical care to some degree. The list goes on and on. I'm grateful for a great wife and to live on a farm. I could go on for 20 hours about the things I'm grateful for. Good health, be able to grow food and buy food. Those are things that most people on the planet don't have access to. And there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about that. So, grateful for many things. That's a bad question.
Let's end it there. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Yeah, this was wonderful.
The problem is that people dig in their heels and they're adverse to changing their minds when confronted with evidence that is counter to their opinion. We have to be open to change. And you have to go into every situation, say, here's maybe why I'm wrong, or maybe I'm wrong, convince me.